I was born and raised in California, and all through my life I thought family was the one thing you could count on, the one thing that would never turn its back on you. And when I became a mother, I believed that even more strongly, because the moment I held my little girl in my arms, I felt like my life finally had its purpose. And I remember whispering to her tiny face that I would always be her mom and that she would always be my baby. And for years that was true, because she would run to me with her messy hair and call out "Mommy" in that sweet little voice. And every time she said it, my heart swelled with pride, because there is no greater honor than to be someone's mom. But life has a way of changing things slowly, so slowly that you don't even realize what's slipping away until it's gone. And I never thought I would live to hear my daughter stop calling me mom. It happened, not all at once, but in little steps that seemed harmless at first, because when she grew a little older, she shortened mommy to just mom. And I told myself it was normal, just a sign that she was growing up. And then later she started saying mother in this tone that felt distant, almost cold. And it stung, but I laughed it off, because what else could I do? And then one day, the day that still feels like a wound in my chest, she looked right at me across the dinner table and called me by my first name, Linda, as if I were just any other person and not the woman who carried her, fed her, and loved her more than life itself. And I remember freezing with the salt shaker in my hand, pretending I had misheard her, but deep down I knew I hadn't, and I forced a smile, because mothers are good at hiding their pain. But inside my heart cracked in a way it never fully healed. And from that day forward, she kept at it. No more mom. Just Linda, where's my bag? Linda, can you drive me? Linda, I'm leaving. And every time she said it, I felt myself shrink, like I was fading into the background of her life, like a shadow on the wall that no one notices anymore. And I kept asking myself what I had done wrong, if I had worked too many hours, if I had scolded her too much, if I had failed her in some way I couldn't even remember, because that's what mothers do. We blame ourselves when our children drift away. And in the quiet of the night, when I lay awake, I would go over every memory, every choice, wondering where I lost her. But no matter how much it hurt, I still loved her. I still cooked every meal with the hope that maybe she'd taste the love in it. I still folded her clothes neatly, hoping she'd feel cared for. I still whispered prayers before bed, asking God to watch over her, even though she barely looked me in the eye anymore. And sometimes when she wasn't home, I would sit on her bed, surrounded by her posters and books and little trinkets she had collected over the years, each one a memory of a happier time. And I would whisper to the empty room, I'm still your mom, even if you don't call me that anymore. Because that's the thing about being a mother. The title can be taken away with a single word, but the love never goes away. And though she tried to erase that word from her lips, she could never erase it from my heart. And still, each time I heard her call me Linda instead of mom, I felt another thread of our bond loosen. And I tried to hold on tighter with kindness, with patience, with quiet love, hoping that one day she would find her way back to me and remember that I wasn't just Linda. I was her mother, the same woman who stayed up with her through fevers, who clapped for her at school plays, who sacrificed so much so she could have a better life. And as painful as it was, I never stopped being proud to be her mom, even if she no longer saw me that way, because a mother's love does not end with words. It lives in silence, in sacrifice, and in the unshakable truth that no matter what she calls me, she will always be my daughter. As the years rolled on, the distance between us grew wider, and I felt like I was watching my daughter build a life where I didn't quite fit anymore, like a puzzle piece left on the table after the picture was complete, and no matter how much I tried to wedge myself back in, the space wasn't there. And I remember the first time she brought her friends over, how she introduced me not as her mom, but just, "This is Linda." And the girls smiled politely, but inside I felt like the ground had shifted under me, because hearing her erase my place in front of others cut deeper than I could show. So I put on a smile and offered them cookies, acting like it didn't matter. But when I went back into the kitchen, I held the counter so tight my knuckles turned white, and I whispered to myself, "I am her mom, I am her mom," as if repeating it would somehow make her remember, but it didn't. And soon, even at home, she stopped acknowledging me in the way children do when they love their mothers without. Thinking, no hugs before bed, no good nights, no secrets shared in whispers like we used to when she was small and crawled under my blanket to talk about her dreams. Instead, she closed her bedroom door more often, kept her headphones on, and her laughter belonged to her friends on the phone instead of me. And I tried to remind myself that teenagers are like that, pulling away to find themselves. But even knowing that didn't take away the ache, because it wasn't just growing up, it was her choice of words, her choice to remove mom from her lips as though it were a burden too heavy for her to carry. And in those days, I started to question if maybe I had loved her too much, if maybe my devotion smothered her instead of comforted her, because I had built my whole world around being her mother. And without that word, without that connection, I felt like a balloon untied, drifting with no direction, and yet I kept trying, because love does not give up, and I found myself doing small things, like leaving notes in her lunch bag, writing "Have a good day, love, Mom," only for the notes to come back crumpled at the bottom of her backpack, unread, and still I kept writing them, because hope is stubborn when it comes from a mother's heart. And I remember one evening, standing outside her door with a plate of her favorite pasta, knocking softly, waiting for her to let me in. And when she finally opened the door, she looked at me with impatience and said, "Thanks, Linda, just leave it." And I handed it over with a smile. But as I walked back down the hallway, the tears came, silent and heavy, because I couldn't understand how the sweetest little girl who once clung to my leg and begged me not to leave her side could now treat me like I was no different from a stranger. And those nights I would sit alone in the living room, staring at old photo albums, running my fingers over pictures of her smiling in my arms, of birthday parties and Christmas mornings, moments where the word Mom was spoken with joy, and I would pray to God to give me strength not to crumble, to keep my heart soft instead of bitter, because even though her words hurt me more than any knife could, I never wanted to be angry at her. I only wanted her back. And as time passed, I began to realize that maybe this was not about me. Maybe she was fighting battles inside herself that I couldn't see. And maybe calling me by my name was her way of claiming independence, of trying to grow away from me. And even though it felt like rejection, I told myself over and over that she still loved me somewhere deep down, even if she didn't show it, even if she didn't say it, because love between a mother and a child cannot be erased so easily. It might be buried, it might be silent, but it is there, and I clung to that belief like a lifeline, and in my loneliest nights I whispered into the dark that one day she would call me Mom again, even if just once, and that when she did, I would hold that word close to my heart and never let it go. The hardest part of it all was not the name itself, but the silence that came with it, because when a child stops calling you Mom, it feels like she is also taking away the warmth, the closeness, and the bond that word carried, and I noticed more and more that our conversations grew shorter, colder, and emptier, with her replies often no more than a shrug or a nod, and sometimes nothing at all. And I would find myself talking into the air, trying to fill the space with gentle words, asking her how her day went or if she needed help with homework, only to be met with the glow of her phone screen instead of her eyes. And in those moments I felt invisible, like a ghost walking through my own home, present but unseen, and it was such a painful kind of loneliness because I lived under the same roof as my daughter, yet I felt farther from her than from strangers passing by on the street. And I kept telling myself that this was just a phase, that she would come around, that teenage years are stormy and confusing. But every time she opened her mouth and called me Linda instead of Mom, I felt that phase was less of a storm passing by and more of a permanent season that I had been forced to live in. And I remember one afternoon when she had a friend over, they were sitting in the living room giggling about something, and she called out, "Linda, can you bring us some snacks?" And her friend glanced at me with a flicker of surprise in her eyes, and I felt such a sharp sting of humiliation, but I swallowed it and brought them chips and soda, setting them down with a smile as if my heart wasn't breaking. And later that night, I cried into my pillow, asking myself how I had become nothing more than a servant in my own home. And the truth that hurt the most was that I never minded serving her. I never minded giving her my time, my hands, my heart, because that is what mothers do. But I wanted to be her mother while doing it, not just Linda, some woman she happened to live with. And as the days went on, I began to withdraw into myself, speaking less, hiding my tears so she wouldn't feel guilt or annoyance. And instead I poured my love into small gestures, hoping she would notice, cooking her favorite meals, fixing her blankets when she left them in a pile, cleaning her shoes so they looked new again. But none of it seemed to reach her. And I started to wonder if maybe she thought less of me because I hadn't accomplished anything great in life except raising her. Maybe she saw me as ordinary, unimportant, not worth the honor of being called Mom. And that thought haunted me because being her mother was the one thing I had been proud of, the one identity I held on to when everything else in life was hard. And now even that was slipping away. And sometimes late at night, I would stand in front of the mirror, staring at my own reflection, whispering my name, Linda, as though I needed to remind myself of who I was outside of being her mom. But it felt so hollow, because my truest name, the name that gave me joy, was Mom, and without it, I felt nameless, drifting like I had lost myself. Yet even in the deepest ache, I never stopped loving her, because that is what mothers are made of, a love that keeps burning even when it is ignored, a love that prays even when no one listens. And I prayed every night, asking God to protect her, to soften her heart, to remind her that she didn't have to push me away to grow. And I held on to that hope because without it, I would have collapsed. And I told myself that one day, maybe when she was older and wiser, she would realize that no matter how far she drifted, she had only one mother. And I prayed that before I left this earth, I would hear her call me Mom again, just once, even if it was in a whisper, because that single word carried more healing power than 1,000 apologies ever could. And though I carried this pain quietly, I carried it with love, because love is heavier than sorrow, but it is also stronger, and it gave me the courage to keep going, to keep waiting, to keep believing in the child I raised, even if she no longer believed in me the same way. As time moved forward, the weight of that missing word began to change the way I carried myself, because when you are no longer called Mom by the very child you gave life to, it is as though someone has stolen a piece of your soul, and even though no one else could see it, I felt like I was walking around with a hole in my heart that no one could mend, and I started noticing how my face no longer lit up the way it once did, how my laughter came less often, and how the silence of the house grew louder and heavier with each passing day. And I remember standing in the grocery store once, holding a carton of milk, when a little girl called out to her mother, "Mommy, look!" with such excitement, and it made me freeze in place because that sound, so natural and so pure, was the very sound that had once filled my own home, and hearing it from a stranger's child made my chest ache as if I had been pierced. And I had to step aside into the aisle, pretending to look at cereal boxes just to hide the tears welling up in my eyes. Because in that moment, I realized how much I missed that word, how much I craved hearing it from the lips of the daughter who had once said it 1,000 times a day without thought, and I felt like a starving soul desperate for a single crumb of affection. And it pained me that what had once been ordinary now felt like an impossible dream. And yet I never let her see how broken I was. Because part of being a mother is protecting your child, not only from the world, but also from your own sorrow, and I told myself that I had to be strong, even if my strength came in the form of silence. But inside I carried memories like treasures, holding on to the sound of her toddler voice saying, "Mommy, I love you," or the way she once scribbled "best mom ever" in crooked handwriting on a homemade card. And I replayed those moments in my mind like an old song I never wanted to forget, because they reminded me that once, even if not now, I had been enough for her. And on nights when the loneliness pressed too heavily, I would sit by the window watching the California sky turn pink and gold at sunset, and I whispered into the fading light, "She is still my daughter, I am still her mom." Like a vow I refused to let time or silence erase. And yet, even as I clung to love, there were moments of bitterness that tried to creep in. Moments when I wondered why she could so easily strip me of the title I had earned through years of sacrifice. And I thought about the nights I stayed awake by her bedside when she was sick, about the times I worked extra shifts to buy her new shoes, about the dreams I gave up so hers could flourish. And I asked myself why all of that seemed invisible to her now. And I fought against anger, because anger can harden a mother's heart, and I never wanted mine to harden toward her. But sometimes in the stillness of the night, I allowed myself to admit the truth, that it hurt to be unappreciated, it hurt to be dismissed, and it hurt most of all to be stripped of the name that meant everything to me. But after those moments of weakness, I always came back to love, because no matter what, love has always been stronger than my pain. And I told myself that if she ever needed me, if life ever knocked her down, I would be there, whether she called me Linda or nothing at all, because that is what mothers do. We show up, we give without asking, we love without conditions. And even if she couldn't see it now, one day she would understand, because life has a way of teaching us what we once ignored. And I believed in my heart that one day, maybe years later, she would look back and realize what she had. And perhaps then she would remember that I wasn't just Linda. I was the woman who had always stood by her side, the woman who had always been and would always be her mother. There came a time when I began to notice that my daughter not only refused to call me mom, but also started to keep pieces of her life hidden away from me. And though I told myself it was normal for young people to seek privacy, it felt different in her case. It felt intentional, almost as if she wanted to erase me completely from the story of who she was becoming. And that thought was heavier than any burden I had ever carried, because I had always imagined that as she grew older she would come to me not less, but more, that she would ask me for advice about love, about friendship, about the struggles of being a woman in this world. And I had so many lessons stored in my heart, ready to hand to her like little lanterns to guide her path. But she never asked, she never opened the door to let me in, and I would sit at the kitchen table sometimes with a cup of tea in my hands, staring at the steam curling up, imagining her walking in and sitting across from me, saying, "Mom, I need to talk." And in those daydreams I would listen to her with all the patience I had, and I would tell her stories from my own life so she wouldn't feel alone, and we would laugh and cry together. But then the tea would grow cold in front of me, and I would realize she hadn't come and probably wouldn't, and the ache inside me would return sharper than before, and the distance grew not only in words but also in physical presence, because she began staying out longer, coming home later sometimes, not even telling me where she had been. And each time I asked gently, she brushed me off with a "Don't worry, Linda," like I was some nosy neighbor instead of the mother who once held her hand when she was too scared to cross the street. And I would lie awake until I heard the door creak open, breathing a sigh of relief just to know she was safe, even if she didn't share her world with me anymore. And I thought about all the things I never told my own mother when I was young, how I thought I knew everything, how I thought I didn't need her. And yet I always still called her mom, because no matter the distance, no matter the secrets, she was still my mother, and I never robbed her of that name. And so I couldn't understand why my own child had done that to me. And in my loneliest moments, I began to wonder if maybe the world was teaching me a lesson I didn't want to learn. Maybe it was showing me that motherhood isn't always a story of closeness. Sometimes it is a story of letting go, of being pushed aside, of being forgotten. And though that thought crushed me, I tried to accept it with grace, because holding on too tightly only seemed to drive her further away. But every now and then, when I caught her laughing on the phone or saw her eyes soften at a funny video, I would see glimpses of the little girl she used to be, and my heart would swell with a mixture of sorrow and hope, because I wanted so badly to believe that the girl who once called me mommy with so much love was still in there, hidden beneath the layers of teenage defiance and growing independence. And I told myself that even if she never called me mom again, I would keep being her mother quietly, steadily, because love doesn't need recognition to exist. And though I longed for the word, I knew my actions spoke louder, and every meal cooked, every worry held in silence, every prayer whispered at night was proof that I was, and always would be her mother, and maybe one day when she was older and perhaps a mother herself, she would look back and understand, and maybe then the word mom would return to her lips, carrying with it all the weight of gratitude and love that she couldn't yet give. And until that day, I would keep waiting, because a mother's patience, though painful, is endless, and her hope, though fragile, is stronger than despair. As the seasons changed and the years moved along, I began to see how the absence of that one small word had reshaped my entire life, because it was never just about being called mom. It was about belonging, about being needed, about knowing that all the sacrifices I made had a name attached to them. And without it, I often felt like a stranger in my own home, walking around quietly, cooking meals, folding laundry, keeping the lights on, yet receiving no acknowledgement beyond a passing thanks, Linda, or sometimes nothing at all. And though to others it might have seemed like a small thing, to me it was like losing my identity piece by piece, because being a mother was not just a role I played, it was who I was at my core, and when she stripped me of that word, I felt like she had peeled away the most important part of me. And I remember one evening sitting alone in the living room while she was out with her friends, staring at the family pictures on the wall, those smiling faces. Frozen in time, the little girl with ribbons in her hair clinging to me, her arms wrapped around my neck, and I thought, what happened to us? What happened to her? What happened to me? And I let myself cry until my chest hurt, because holding it in had begun to weigh me down. And yet, even in my tears, I whispered prayers for her happiness, because that is what mothers do. We love even when it hurts. We give even when nothing is returned. And I found myself thinking often about my own mother, about how I had never truly understood her sacrifices until I grew older. And maybe that was the way of life. Maybe children cannot see their mothers clearly until time has given them wisdom. And so I tried to remind myself that perhaps one day my daughter, too, would see me differently, but the waiting was lonely, and there were days when I felt invisible to the world. So I began writing letters to her in a little notebook, letters she never saw, where I poured out all the words I wanted to say. Things like, I miss you calling me mom, and I am still the same mother who kissed your scraped knees and held you when you were afraid. And sometimes just, I love you. And though she never read those words, writing them helped me breathe, helped me keep my love alive in the silence. And one night, when I was especially tired and broken, I left the notebook open on the table by accident. And when I woke the next morning, it had been moved. And for a moment, I wondered if she had seen it, if she had read even one page. But she never said anything, and I never asked, because I didn't want to scare away the small possibility that a piece of my heart had reached her. And as the days went on, I noticed tiny changes, not enough to fill the hole, but enough to keep my hope alive, like how she lingered a little longer at the table after dinner, or how she once laughed at a story I told instead of rolling her eyes. And though she still called me Linda, there was something softer in her tone. And I held on to those little mercies as if they were gold, because when you are starved for love, even crumbs can keep you alive, and I told myself that patience was the only answer. That one day she would come back to me in her own way, in her own time, and until then I would keep standing quietly, steadily, like the roots of a tree, unseen but holding her life together from beneath, because no matter what name she used, the truth that no one could take from me was that she was my daughter, and I was her mother, and no word, no silence, no distance could erase that bond that had been written not just in blood, but in every sleepless night, every whispered prayer, and every ounce of love I had poured into her since the moment she was born. As the years rolled into one another, I carried that ache in my chest like a hidden stone, heavy but tucked away where no one could see it, and though my daughters still call me Linda, I began to notice that life has its way of softening even the hardest distances, because little by little she began to look at me with eyes that weren't so cold anymore, and sometimes she would sit with me while I cooked, asking questions about recipes, laughing at some silly memory, and though the word Mom still never left her lips, I could feel that the wall between us was no longer as high as it once was, and I held on to those small moments like treasures, because they reminded me that love was not gone, only buried. And then one day something happened that I will never forget. She came home looking tired and fragile in a way I hadn't seen since she was a child, and for the first time in years, she sat down beside me, her voice shaking as she said she had been hurt by someone she trusted. And in that moment, all the years of silence and distance melted away, because before me wasn't the independent young woman who had pushed me aside. It was my little girl, scared and needing comfort, and without hesitation I pulled her into my arms, holding her as tightly as I did when she was small, and I whispered to her that everything would be all right, that she wasn't alone, and she cried into my chest the way she used to, letting me be her safe place again. And though she didn't call me Mom in that moment, I felt it in the way she clung to me, in the way she allowed herself to be vulnerable again. And a few days later, when the weight of her trouble seemed to ease, she looked at me across the kitchen table, her eyes red but softer than they had been in years, and she said quietly, almost like she was testing the sound, "Thanks, Mom." And my breath caught in my throat, because it had been so long since I had heard that word from her lips that I thought I might never hear it again. And the sound of it felt like a healing balm poured over every wound I had carried. And though she quickly moved on, pretending it was nothing, for me it was everything. It was proof that deep down she still knew who I was, that despite the distance, despite the stubborn years, the bond between a mother and daughter had not been erased, only hidden beneath layers of growing up. And I went to bed that night with tears on my pillow, but this time they were not just tears of sorrow, they were tears of gratitude, because I had waited so long for that word, and it had finally found its way back to me. And I realized then that love never truly disappears. It may go quiet, it may go missing for a season, but it lives in the roots of who we are, and sometimes all we can do as mothers is keep loving, keep waiting, keep believing that one day the seed we planted will bloom again. And as I look back on those years now, I see them not only as a story of pain, but also as a story of endurance, because they taught me that even when a child pulls away, even when the word Mom is taken from your lips, you never stop being one in your heart. And eventually, in their own time, they will come to see it too. And today, when I hear my daughter call me Mom, even if it is not often, it feels like the sweetest gift, one I no longer take for granted, because I know what it is like to live without it. And I want to tell every mother who feels forgotten, who feels invisible, that you are not alone, and that your love matters more than you know, because though our children may not always see it right away, love has a way of circling back, and one day, when they are ready, they will remember, and the word you long for will return, carrying with it all the meaning it always had, and perhaps even more, because absence makes us treasure the things we once overlooked, And that is how my story ends, not with bitterness, but with hope, because my daughter did come back to me, not in grand gestures, but in the simple, precious word that I had been waiting for, Mom.